On the 16th of April 1947, one of the most terrible war criminals of World War II made his way out to the scaffold. He was led out by a hooded executioner who helped him up onto a chair underneath the gallows. This was the execution of the Commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, and there were many other men who were involved in the running of the concentration camps who were later executed. The commandants of the concentration camps were responsible for the slaughter and deaths of millions of people, and they were the men who ensured that the guards were brutal, and they were also responsible for the conditions. Many prisoners succumbed to starvation, overwork, disease, and terrifying torture and execution. But at the end of the war, a number of the commandants themselves were taken to the gallows for their executions. Welcome to the Untold Past. Today we look in detail at the executions of the concentration camp commandants, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe.
Rudolf Höss would join the Nazi Party in 1922, following hearing a speech from Hitler in Munich, and he would participate in brutal acts under the guise of the party. He would be part of a group who would beat a schoolteacher to death, who Martin Bormann wished dead, but Höss was tried as a ringleader and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was known for being a rather violent man, and after his release he married and had 5 children. Höss had become acquainted with Heinrich Himmler and joined the SS on the 1st of April 1934, moving to the Death's Heads unit. Höss would idolise Himmler, and he even preferred the head of the SS to Hitler himself. Höss was first assigned to Dachau concentration camp in December 1934 and would work there as a block leader. After promotion within the SS to captain, he would become an adjutant to Hermann Baranowski at Sachsenhausen, who was involved in the leadership of the camp. At Sachsenhausen he would lead the firing squad, and it would be Höss who led the execution of August Dickmann, the first conscientious objector to be executed after the war began on the 15th of September 1939. Höss even fired the finishing deadly shot from his pistol. He would then transfer to the Waffen-SS in 1939 after the Germans invaded Poland, and he was rather thought of within this organisation and recommended for promotion. On the 1st of May 1940, Höss would begin the role in which he would be most famous for. He was appointed commandant of a prison camp in western Poland, and the camp had been built around an old army barracks and was named Auschwitz. Höss would go on to command the camp for 3 years, and he turned the camp into a huge expansive complex known as Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. He had been briefed to create a transition camp for 10,000 prisoners from the existing buildings, but he had different ideas. He wanted to create the most efficient camp he could, certainly more efficient than what he had seen in the past. Höss would even move into Auschwitz himself inside a villa, along with his wife and children, and would, despite his horrific work in organising mass murder, live a relatively normal home life. Auschwitz at its peak would be made up of 3 different facilities, and it was served by many sub-camps. The whole camp was built on around 20,000 acres, with Auschwitz I being the main admin centre, Auschwitz II Birkenau being the extermination camp, and Auschwitz III Monowitz being the slave labour camp for German industrial conglomerates. Höss would secretly meet with Himmler in June 1941 after hearing about the order for the final solution. Himmler had chosen Höss's camp Auschwitz for the extermination of Europe's Jewish population due to its easy access by rail, and also because of the huge site that had been set up. The project was described as secret, and Höss began to develop and test different ways of massacring as many people as possible in the most efficient way. Auschwitz would become the most efficient instrument in the Holocaust, and the camp would develop further to become even more efficient in its method of killing. Höss would experiment with different methods of gassing prisoners in order to kill the most people as quick as he could, and during his reign as commandant he would oversee the deaths of hundreds of thousands. After his arrest he would state, "I myself never knew the total number, and I have nothing to help me arrive at an estimate. I can only remember the figures involved in the larger actions. From Upper Silesia and the general government 250,000, Germany 100,000, Holland 95,000, Belgium 20,000, France 110,000, Greece 65,000, Hungary 400,000, and Slovakia 90,000. This brings his total of killings to 1.1 million. He would then say, "I can no longer remember the figures for the smaller actions. I regard a total of 2.5 million deaths as far too high. Even Auschwitz had its limits to its destructive capabilities." Höss would be removed from Auschwitz in 1943 after he had an affair with an inmate, and this could have resulted in him being relieved from command. He would return on the 8th of May 1944 to oversee Operation Höss, in which 430,000 Hungarian Jews were transported to Auschwitz and executed in just 56 days. The sheer number and volume was so huge that the camp struggled logistically to deal with the genocide, with thousands of bodies being burned in open pits. Höss would then finish his career at Ravensbrück, organising the gassing of prisoners within that camp. He would be arrested in March 1946, despite attempting to bite a cyanide pill, and he would be called to testify at the Nuremberg trials, being called as a defence witness by the lawyer of Ernst Kaltenbrunner. He would reveal that he estimated 2.5 million were executed at Auschwitz during his time in command of the camp, with the figure representing around 70 to 80% of all those who were sent to the camp. Whilst he was accused of murdering 3.5 million people, he said, "No, only 2.5 million, the rest died from disease and starvation." Höss would be handed over to the Polish authorities, who would try him for murder. Whilst in prison he would write about his experiences, and he would write how he'd been mistreated by the British whilst held in captivity. During his trial he was calm and controlled, and he knew what fate would await him. At the end of the trial he would ask to send his wedding ring to his wife, and the court would announce its verdict, sentencing Höss to death by hanging on April 2nd, 1947. The day after the verdict was passed, former prisoners of Auschwitz would ask the court for the execution of Rudolf Höss to take place on the grounds of his own concentration camp. It was scheduled for the 14th of April, however had to be postponed, as it was feared that local residents would attempt to lynch Höss when he was being taken to his site of execution. Instead, the date of his execution was moved back to the 16th of April. The gallows had been made by German prisoners of war, with a trapdoor fitted into it. Höss arrived at Auschwitz for his execution at 8 a.m. and was taken to the building that once housed his office. He asked for a cup of coffee, and after he had finished this he was taken to a cell in Block 11, the death block of Auschwitz. At 10 o'clock he was led out to his execution. He was calm and strolled confidently throughout the camp he had once oversaw, and he walked towards the gallows. His hands were handcuffed and restrained behind his back, and the executioners had to help him climb onto a stool, which the stool had been placed above the trap door. A priest, Father Zaremba, approached Höss, who stood on the stool, and then the prosecutor read out the sentence. The executioner then placed the noose around Höss's neck. Höss then adjusted it with a movement of his head, and then the hangman pulled out the stool from below the former commandant of Auschwitz. His body struck the trap door, which opened, and Höss was left hanging. The priest began to recite a prayer for the condemned and dying. The execution occurred at 10:08 a.m, and at 10:21 he was pronounced dead by a physician. Höss was probably cremated, with his remains being scattered in an unknown location. Höss, 4 days before his execution, would realise the huge crimes he had committed, writing, "As commandant of Auschwitz, I was responsible for carrying out part of the cruel plans of the Third Reich for human destruction." It was this human destruction that was placed in the forefront of his mind when he came to expand and rule over one of the most inhumane and despicable places on earth, Auschwitz. He was an intensely cruel man, whose crimes and legacy would write him in the history books as one of the most evil men in the history of the Holocaust. Rudolf Höss would finally get his comeuppance in the place in which he inflicted so much horror and suffering onto the world. Josef Kramer was born and brought up in Munich inside a middle-class Roman Catholic family. His family would move to Augsburg, where Josef was schooled, and following his education he worked as an apprentice electrician in 1920. He would then later be mostly unemployed, after stints working in a department store and as an accountant. Kramer would join the Nazi Party on the 1st of December 1931, and would then join the SS in 1932. During his strict SS training, he would work as a prison guard, and then when the Second World War broke out, were transferred to guarding concentration camps and inmates who were imprisoned there. He had been assigned as a guard at Dachau concentration camp in 1934, and during his time spent here, he would rise rapidly as he experienced promotion after promotion. He would then become a senior figure in the leadership of Sachsenhausen and also Mauthausen camps, and during this he would catch the attention of higher-ranking Nazis. It was clear that within the concentration camp system, Josef Kramer found a home and a purpose for possibly one of the first times in his life. He would become the assistant to Rudolf Höss, the infamous commandant of Auschwitz, who would go on to oversee the mass murder of around 1.5 million people inside Auschwitz. In 1940, Kramer was his number 2, and he would accompany Höss to inspect Auschwitz and even helped with investigations as to whether the site would be suitable for a new oil and rubber plant, which at the time Germany was suffering from a shortage of. The goal would have been to use labour from the camp in this plant. Because of his work, Kramer would be given control of his own concentration camp, Natzweiler Stutthof, in April 1941, which was established in the Alsace-Lorraine area of France. It was the only camp established within France by the Nazis. It was here in which Kramer would take part in many more crimes of the Holocaust. For example, he personally, as commandant, performed the gassings of 80 Jewish men and women who had been selected to be used in a Jewish skeleton collection, which was to be housed at the Reich University of Strasbourg. 46 of these inmates were Jews from Greece, and it wasn't just men who were killed, with women suffering Kramer's brutality too. Kramer would admit later during his trial that the purpose of the Natzweiler camp was to let prisoners work in the nearby quarry, and he would admit that he gassed these individuals on the orders of Heinrich Himmler. He would state how he forced the people himself into the gas chamber, and that women inside the chamber continued to breathe for around half a minute before succumbing to the gas. The Nazis would recognise Kramer's work within the system, and he was promoted to the rank of Hauptsturmführer or captain in 1942. He would then be transferred in May 1944 to become the camp commander in charge of operations at Auschwitz II-Birkenau. This was the main extermination element within the complex of Auschwitz, and Kramer would oversee the deaths of dozens of thousands of people within the gas chambers of Auschwitz and the crematoria. He was brought to the camp to help manage the gassings of newly transported prisoners in May 1944, and he would later be deemed to have been responsible for the murders committed in Auschwitz. He would maintain that he would not take part in the selection processes. However, this would later be proved otherwise, when witnesses would state how Kramer took an active role in the selection parades. In one example, he would even load people onto the trucks, and even beat them severely when they would oppose this and resist. Josef would claim that, "I never took part in the selections. I asked myself, is it really right about these persons who go to the gas chambers? I did not know what the purpose of the gas chamber was." Whilst he was at the camp, there was a revolt at Auschwitz on the 7th of October 1944, where inmates rose up to destroy the crematoria. Kramer would confirm that corporal punishment was allowed at Auschwitz, and how he administered torture around 40 times during his short stint there, and he would also confirm that guards were allowed dogs. During his trial and other defendants' trials, it would be alleged that dogs were used to be set upon the prisoners. During his time at Auschwitz, it would also be claimed that he lashed someone with 25 strikes of his whip, and that he gave out regular beatings, and that he shot prisoners randomly with his machine gun, and also that he encouraged dogs to be set on the prisoners. It would be at Bergen-Belsen that Josef Kramer would get his nickname of the Beast at. In December 1944, he was transferred from Auschwitz-Birkenau to Bergen-Belsen. The camp had originally been a temporary camp for those fleeing Germany, however had expanded throughout the Second World War. Belsen would not have gas chambers inside it, however the rule of Kramer was so brutal and horrific that he would receive the nickname the Beast of Belsen. Kramer claimed that when he came to the camp there was not much of an issue with food, however as new prisoners were transported there, the situation regarding food seemed dire. At the time the Allies would conduct air raids to bring the Third Reich to its knees, and with this Belsen suffered greatly from a lack of supplies. Also the weather affected the ability to get supplies quickly to the camp, but the main problem with supplies was caused by the overcrowding. The Red Army were advancing quickly towards Germany, and because of this, many of the prisoners in camps in the eastern occupied territories were moved to Belsen. Around 85,000 prisoners were transported in cattle cars or force-marched to Belsen. In July 1944, before Kramer was commandant, there would be 7,300 prisoners, but after there would be 60,000 by April 1945. With the sheer overcrowding and the German defeat appearing on the horizon, the administrative systems of the camp broke down, but Kramer would continue to try and rule. In March 1945, he would ask for help and resources, as at the time 250 to 300 inmates a day were dying from a horrendous typhus epidemic, which was running riot throughout the camp. Prisoners kept being drafted to Belsen, however the end for the camp was on the horizon. With the collapse of administration, and also with the war heading for a defeat for the Third Reich, many of the guards abandoned their duties and would flee the camp, leaving the inmates to fend for themselves. Kramer would refuse to leave the camp, and when Belsen was liberated by the British, he even took the British on a tour of the camp to inspect the horrific sights which greeted them. Huge piles of corpses and death surrounded them, and the scenes were incredibly desperate, with mass graves being filled in and full, with nowhere to bury those who had recently passed away from the conditions. The British would find barracks filled with prisoners, some too emaciated to even walk, and disease was a huge problem inside the camp still. Kramer, because of this, was then imprisoned and held at Hamelin prison. He was placed on trial for his involvement in the war crimes, and during this, information would come out about how horrific the Beast of Belsen truly was. He would routinely just beat and kick prisoners who were too weak to work, would select those who were to be gassed, and would encourage guards to tear prisoners limb from limb. Kramer even allegedly kicked one woman to death during selections, and even starved a number of Russian inmates to death as they'd stolen bread. Kramer, also at Belsen days before liberation, would shoot and kill 2 prisoners who found some rotten potatoes that were lying on the ground, and his activities in Auschwitz would also come to light. For all of his cruelty, he was sentenced to death and was to be hanged at Hamelin prison by Albert Pierpoint on the 13th of December 1945. Along with 10 of his guards, the Beast of Belsen would be hanged. The executions began at 9:30 a.m. and were continued throughout the day until 4 p.m. First, a number of women, including Irma Gries, were executed, with Pierpoint and his assistant performing the executions. Josef Kramer would be imprisoned in a small cell in Hamelin prison, and at the bottom of the row of cells would be the execution chamber, where Pierpoint would administer the justice. He would perform the executions in pairs, and at around 12:15 p.m, Kramer, along with Dr. Fritz Klein, were fetched from their cells and brought forward to the execution chamber. A gallows with 2 nooses would have greeted the pair, and they made their way up to the scaffold to meet their maker. At 12:19 p.m, Josef Kramer and Dr. Fritz Klein were both hanged simultaneously inside the chamber. They had been the first of the men to be executed after the women were killed. They were hanged using Pierpoint's methods, and then after death was confirmed by the assistant and the doctor, they were cut down. It's assumed that the bodies were then cremated, with the ashes being scattered in an unknown location. Josef Kramer seemed like a man who seemed to thrive inside the concentration camp system, and with leadership over the mass murder of innocents, he seemed to have found his purpose in life. He inflicted a huge degree of suffering and barbarism on thousands whilst in command of different camps, and he made dozens of thousands of people's lives much worse. He was a man who certainly, through his horrific acts, definitely deserves the nickname, the Beast of Belsen.
Gerhard Friedrich Ernst Flesch was born on the 8th of October 1909 inside of Posen in Prussia, and it's believed that he had an ordinary early life. He studied political sciences and law in Marburg. However, inside of Germany, there was a huge political shift coming. Inside of the nation, the Nazis and Adolf Hitler were rising to power and prominence, and their numbers expanded to a huge extent in the 1930s. Hitler promised to restore national pride following the end of the First World War, and he also promised better employment opportunity, food on the table for everyone, and better opportunities all around. But Gerhard Flesch was one of those people who this appealed to, and he became a member of the Nazi Party in 1933. He then managed the following year to obtain his law degree, and learned university-educated men was seen of value to the SS in some capacity, but he was then recruited years later to go and serve inside of the Gestapo, the secret police. The Gestapo were ruthless in their actions, and they would round up opponents of the Nazis and those who dissented against Hitler, and they often carried out terrific torture ordeals which resulted in the deaths of the victim, as they were battered by the agents. Specifically, Flesch had been appointed by Reinhard Heinrich to take over a Gestapo unit, who were keeping a close eye on religion across Germany, and he was dealing with religious groups who he believed could rise up and bring problems for the Nazis. His group were involved in rounding up many priests and members of the clergy who would be sent to concentration camps later on. But in 1938 he was then involved in the German occupation of the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia, which Hitler would absorb into his empire. Further promotion then came inside of the Nazi hierarchy and the SS, and he was later made an SS Obersturmbannführer, and Flesch also was an advisor to the Gauleiter of Thuringia, Fritz Sauckel, a man who was later executed at the Nuremberg trials for his crimes. But following the outbreak of the Second World War, Gerhard Flesch was involved in many horrific crimes, which resulted in the slaughter of hundreds. He was given command of Einsatzkommando 2-6, based in Posen, his hometown. These were death squads that carried out the ruthless executions of civilians, and the group under Flesch's command executed 275 Polish people who had been named as Polish patriots and religious leaders. They did this using gunshot, and also executed by Flesch's men were teachers, police officers and other civilians, but this then began Operation Tannenberg, the ruthless plan by the Nazis to wipe out the Polish leaders in regions occupied by the Nazis. Flesch's troops continued to execute, and in November 1939 his men shot another 40 people, but then following the German invasion of France, he was part of an SS division that headed into the region. Further movement came for Gerhard Flesch, as he was then sent in April 1940 to Norway. The German occupation of the country began on the 9th of April 1940, and armed resistance ended in June 1940, and the Nazis held Norway until the end of the war in Europe. Inside the land, there were many Norwegians who collaborated with the Nazi authorities, and some of them were incredibly brutal, such as Henry Rinnen, who led an execution squad and torture squad who worked with the Gestapo to infiltrate the Norwegian resistance. Gerhard Flesch was given the job in Norway as a commander of the SIPO and the SD, the Secret Security Service. He was also involved in the intelligence services of the SS and the security police. This meant he was involved in many high-profile investigations upon resistors, and he was also involved in Gestapo investigations. He was a senior leader in the German secret services, and then became the commander of the SD and the SIPO in Trondheim. In this region he was overseeing the arrest of many members of the Norwegian resistance. These were often subjected to harrowing torture ordeals, where they would be beaten and battered heavily. Some even succumbed to their ordeals. They then died at the hands of Flesch's torturers, and he was also then made the chief of the Faustad concentration camp. This was a concentration camp inside of Norway, where many prisoners were sent to, and there were around 4,500 prisoners who passed through the camp from different countries. It became a site of execution, where the nearby forest was used regularly by the SS for this, as gunshots would crash out from the area next to the camp. There were many people sent to the forest next to the camp for their execution, and a number of these were resistance fighters, and around 150 people were shot in it. There were efforts later at the end of the war to exhume the victims, and these were then thrown by the Nazis into a nearby fjord to conceal their crimes. Still today, many of the victims of these executions are being searched for, and identification is still ongoing 80 years after the conflict. But Gerhard Flesch was the man who ordered the executions of many of these people, and he had gained a reputation for being a notorious torturer. He remained in control of the concentration camps, and also the prisons in Trondheim, where many people were tortured and executed until the end of the war, and he then, as a German capitulation occurred, made the decision to try and escape capture. He was caught though fleeing Trondheim on the 8th of May 1945, and in his possession he had a gold bar. Probably he kept this with the intention of beginning a new life, but this gold had been stolen, presumably from prisoners. He He was then sent back with a police escort, and he was arrested and accused of horrific crimes against humanity. In 1946, he was brought for trial, and the courtroom heard from many witnesses who documented the evil crimes that Gerhard Flesch had been involved in. He was charged with many war crimes, that included 7 charges of ordering murders of a total of 37 prisoners, 5 charges of torture, and 1 charge of preventing medical treatment, which resulted in the deaths of prisoners. The court heard of the horrors of his cruelty, and Gerhard Flesch was then found guilty of ordering 25 murders, with 21 of these being carried out, and he was also found guilty of all counts involving torture, and also the charge of withholding medical treatment. For these crimes he was sentenced to death, to be executed by a firing squad. Of course, the court did not take into account his actions in Poland, where he had ordered and been involved in the executions of hundreds. He was held inside of prison for a while, whilst he appealed to try and negate his death sentence, but this appeal was rejected. On the 28th of February 1948, shortly before midnight, he was told that his execution was to be carried out imminently, and he was taken to Christiansand Fortress, where he was to be shot by a firing squad. He was led out into a clearing, and there was an execution post where he was secured and tied to. The former SS officer was stood opposite his firing squad, who stood with their weapons at ease. They were waiting for the order to shoot. Gerhard Flesch was then given a blindfold, so he could not see his final moments. Then the order to ready was given to the firing squad. Within minutes of arriving on the range, the command to fire was given, and the weapons crashed, and instantly Gerhard Flesch was executed. But right before the order to fire had been given, he screamed Heil Hitler, meaning his final words were his devotion to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Gerhard Flesch was 38 years old when he was executed inside a fortress, inside a town, where he committed many crimes during the Second World War. Inside of Poland, he had commanded execution squads who ruthlessly shot hundreds of people, but when he was sent to Norway, he was made one of the most senior SS officials inside the country, and he went on the offensive and executed many different members of the Norwegian resistance. At the end of the conflict, there were many efforts by the nation to purge elements of the Nazi occupation and senior figures who had brought horror to the land, and Gerhard Flesch was one of many who was executed for his actions during the war in Norway.
Karl Peter Berg was born on the 18th of April 1907, but it's believed that he had a normal upbringing. However, he was attracted to the Nazi politics. He would join the party officially, but during the Second World War, Berg then joined the SS, Heinrich Himmler's paramilitary branch of the party, and he also became a member of the German military. He rose in the SS to the rank of an SS Hauptscharführer. He then was given command of his own concentration camp and transit camp based in the Netherlands. The Germans invaded the Netherlands on the 10th of May 1940, but within a week the Dutch forces would crumble, and the Germans then occupied the whole country. During the invasion there were a huge amount of paratroopers who were dropped, and these soldiers quickly overran the Dutch and left the Dutch army to be completely dominated. They knew that they could not stop the bombing aircraft that were hitting and levelling Dutch towns and cities, and with this there was a cease of hostilities and the acceptance of a German occupation. Life in the occupied Netherlands was tough, especially for those who were persecuted, and many Jews tried to hide out and flee from the Germans. Hitler did think highly of the Dutch people, but as the war went on, there was lots of starvation and suffering. Shortly after the occupation began, the Nazis began to persecute the Jews of the Netherlands, and mass deportations of people to transit camps and concentration camps then began. Karl Peter Berg would become the commandant of Camp Schul, or the Schul transit camp. This was built in 1939 as a Dutch army camp, but then following the Nazi invasion it was held for the Germans. Amongst the prisoners who were sent there were some British, French and Belgian soldiers, but then the first Jews arrived there in February 1941 from Amsterdam. These were brought here in an army truck, and they then stayed for 4 days before they were moved on to Buchenwald and then Mauthausen. Only 2 prisoners of this group then survived the war. It was a transit camp where prisoners were kept for some time before they were moved on to other death camps. But there was no labour at Camp Schul, and there was enough food to go around. But despite being at the camp a few months,
The Germans shut Camp Schürl, and Karl Peter Berg was then moved elsewhere, with the prisoners moving on to other sites. The camp was too small, and there was not enough room to expand, but Berg then moved onto Camp Amersfoort, and this was a concentration camp which was much larger. He was appointed as a deputy commander of the camp, and served under Walter Heinrich, the commander, but Heinrich became ill, and then Berg was appointed as a deputy commander, and he then held and wielded a significant amount of power over the prisoners. Camp Amersfoort held 37,000 prisoners during the Second World War, and 650 would be killed there. After the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans sent hundreds of Soviet prisoners of war there, and many of these were left to die in the cold winter, or they were executed in the woods near to the camp. Amersfoort was also considered a transit camp, where prisoners would be sent then on to sites such as Buchenwald and Mauthausen, where they would be killed on arrival. Despite thousands not dying here, the next destination for the prisoners would usually result in death. But inside of Camp Amersfoort, Karl Peter Berg, the deputy commander, would involve himself in the atrocities and executions of prisoners each day. He was known for mistreating prisoners, and he would appoint other brutal SS guards and staff to work alongside him. One former prisoner said of Berg's camp that, when the vans reached the camp, they emptied their passengers who were taken over by the SS guards. These began to drive them, cursing and swearing, beating them on their backs with their truncheons, into a hut, where they were to pass the night without having a meal. The hut was divided into two sections, one for men, one for women. It was separated from the main camp by a barbed wire fence. Altogether, the camp held at that moment about 300 men, women and children. The beds were iron frames arranged in a double tier, without mattresses of any kind. Our prisoners threw themselves on the bare springs, trying to snatch a few minutes' sleep, but few slept that night, if only because the guards kept switching the lights on and off from time to time, as a precaution against attempts to escape, which was next to impossible in any case. Their cold, harsh voices filled the prisoners with anxiety about the future, and in these circumstances it is anxiety which can turn a prison into hell on earth. There was a lot of violence by the guards, and the prisoners were made weak from their work, and there was little food and poor hygiene at the camp. There was illness and disease spreading around the camp, and many succumbed to these issues. Berg was a very cruel man, who was also described as a predator who derived great pleasure from the agony of others, and it was said that during roll call he loved to sneak about unnoticed behind the rows of men and catch someone in some violation, such as talking or not following orders properly. With a big grin he would then torment his victims. One of Berg's most infamous actions was appointing SS officer Josef as a camp leader, and it was said of him that, on the 23rd of December, Katala announced a ban on parcels for 3 weeks, which meant no Red Cross presents for Christmas or New Year. He further cancelled breakfast, lunch and dinner on Christmas Day itself, using the discovery of a smuggled letter as a pretext. And as an extra punishment for Christmas morning, he kept the men standing on the parade ground, which was covered with thick snow, for their roll call at 7 till 7:30 midday. A few days before, the geese for the guards' Christmas dinner had been on show, hanging on the barbed wire. Berg was involved in the executions of the camp, and he was involved in the executions of at least 77 Soviet prisoners of war, and around 200 other prisoners and inmates. Under his leadership, the living conditions of the prisoners was awful, and as the Second World War turned against the Germans, Berg tried to flee and escape any form of justice. He was then arrested and was imprisoned for a number of years, but in 1949 he was brought to trial. There are many interesting images taken of Berg in these years, and he would even be held inside of his own camp and site. He was then tried as a war criminal, and following this was sentenced to death. On the 22nd of November 1949, at the age of 42, Karl Peter Berg, one of the most evil Nazis inside of the Netherlands, was taken to a firing range in Fort Bilma. He was brought to a stake and was then tied and secured to this, but as the firing squad was readied, they stood with their rifles aimed at the former Nazi commandant. With this, Karl Berg had one last trick up his sleeve. He screeched to the commandant to fire himself, and he shouted at the top of his lungs, "Fire," before the officer in charge of the firing squad did, and the firing squad followed the instructions of the Nazi officer, as they were trigger happy. He was instantly killed, and following this, Berg was then buried in an anonymous grave in Amsterdam. Karl Peter Berg was a commandant of various Nazi transit camps in the Netherlands, and he would be responsible for the conditions of the sites.
His camps were known for being awful, and for the conditions being terrible, with food supplies and rations being too small. He was also a man who suffered a military death, rather than that of a war criminal, as he would be executed by a firing squad, which was considered more honourable than being taken to the gallows to be hanged. But he ordered the firing squad to shoot, and with this the executioners shot on his orders, rather than the officer in charge.
Amon Göth was born in Vienna in December 1908, and his family were reasonably wealthy. They owned a publishing house, and it was believed he would later go on to work in the family business, but this would not be the case. Göth had a normal upbringing, and he then went to school to study farming, but he dropped out due to the lure of the Nazis and right-wing politics that took him away from this career. At the time, the Nazi Party was operational in Austria, and it would later then become banned, but Amon Göth joined the local Nazi youth groups, and he also became very anti-Semitic. He joined the Nazi Party as a fully paid-up member in 1931, and he was referred to as an Alter Kämpfer, or an old fighter, for the Nazi cause, and Göth was well respected. He would become fully immersed in the Nazi groups, including the SA, Hitler's brown shirts, who would disrupt political meetings and would cause chaos with the communists and enemies of the Nazis. They were violent thugs, and Göth was one of these men, and he would later transfer across to the SS, and he stayed in Vienna because he was forced to flee Germany. Göth was wanted for possessing explosives for the Nazi political groups, and he continued to work smuggling weapons into Austria for the Austrian SS, and he would then run goods across the border. He was arrested many times throughout these years, and would even be arrested for being linked to the assassination of Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, but then Göth would flee justice by being sheltered inside of Dachau concentration camp. He was of course not a prisoner, but instead went to Dachau to train as a concentration camp guard, and this would take him into a camp for the very first time. Amon Göth did try to leave the SS at one point, but following the Anschluss of Austria, he became more indulgent in the Nazi lifestyle, and he would rise throughout the ranks of the group. As the Second World War broke out, he would be based in Poland, and he was a well-respected member within the SS, and was seen as a skilled administrator. He began to work on paperwork for the transportation, deportation, and eventual slaughter of swathes of the Jewish population of Poland, and he would work on establishing ghettos inside of Polish cities. He was later transferred to Lublin to work on Operation Reinhard, the creation of 3 extermination centres, and centres where people were sent, where they would be slaughtered within minutes of arriving. Göth would be involved in the roundups of victims before they were then deported, but he was then moved to be involved in the SS Death Heads unit, who would oversee the creation and staffing of the concentration camps. But his first job in the group was to oversee a brand new concentration camp, which became known as Krakow-Plaszow, and this camp would become huge. Amon Göth was interviewed for the position of the Commandant by Heinrich Himmler, and he got the job, but the camp took 1 month to make. The Nazis would use the site of an old Jewish cemetery to become part of the new camp, and following the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto, those prisoners considered fit enough to work were sent to the new camp, and those who were not were slaughtered. When the prisoners arrived at the camp, Amon Göth would speak to the inmates, and he made bold claims and statements, and he said, "I am your God," and he wanted the prisoners to worship him. He was a man who had overall power, however his brutal side came as soon as the camp opened. He was a man who had previously shot over 100 women and children himself during the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto, and as more prisoners were sent to his concentration camp, Göth became even more ruthless. He was known for acts of cruelty, and the prisoners were terrified of him. One witness would state that one incident regarding Amon Göth saw him approached by a Jewish lady whose fiancé was cleaning up. She begged the commandant to stay with him, and he refused and told her to turn around, where Göth then pulled out his pistol and shot her dead. It was said she fell dead, and after that he separated all the people again. Another witness to his brutality stated, "My sister Hella was in a group of women sitting, breaking tombstones into tiny pieces for building roads. Göth appeared and told an older woman she was not doing it right. Göth then showed her how to do it, and then shot the woman." Another former prisoner of Amon Göth's site would state of him that he was a hideous and terrible monster. He set the fear of death in people, terrified masses, and accounted for much chattering of teeth. He ran the camp through extremes of cruelty that are beyond the comprehension of a compassionate mind, employing tortures which dispatched the victims to hell. For even the slightest rule infraction, he would rain blow after blow upon the face of the helpless offender, would observe with satisfaction born of sadism how the cheek of his victim would swell and turn blue, how the teeth would fall out and the eyes fill with tears. Anyone who was whipped by him was forced to count in a loud voice. Each stroke of the whip, as if he made a mistake, was forced to start counting again. During interrogations he set his dog upon the accused, who was strung up by his legs from a hook in the ceiling. In the event of an escape, he would order the entire group from which the escapee had come to form a row, would then give the order to count to 10, and would then personally kill every 10th person. At one morning parade in the presence of all prisoners, he shot a Jew because he complained the man was too tall, and then as the man lay dying, he urinated on him. Once he caught a boy who was sick with diarrhoea and was unable to restrain himself. Göth then forced him to eat all the excrement and then shot him. The camp he was running epitomised the brutality and evil of the Commandant, and it was obvious to anyone that Amon Göth was a horrific and brutal man. The camp itself to begin with only housed 2,000 people, but then when it expanded 25,000 prisoners would be held at one point, and around 150,000 people passed through the barbed wire fences. It was acting as a transit camp, but whilst the camp's conditions were terrible, Göth lived inside of a luxurious villa, and he would sit on the balcony of it and would shoot prisoners with his rifle. If a prisoner saw his hat on the villa's balcony, they knew the shooting would begin, and Göth would shoot the inmates almost as if they were tin cans at a fair. He himself lived very well, and he indulged in banquets and drank very heavily, all whilst the prisoners yards away were starving. He lived very comfortably, even having a Jewish cobbler who made him his own shoes each week. But whilst he was a commandant, between 8,000 and 12,000 prisoners died inside of the camp. The main execution site was nearby and was known as a Hajerwa Gurkha. But Amon Göth would fly too close to the sun, and his brutal streak would bring him crashing down. He was a man who was even seen as too brutal for the SS, and he would be sacked as a commandant of Krakow-Plaszow, as he was accused of stealing and bringing the SS as an organisation into disrepute. The theft of Jewish property which he was indulging in was against Nazi laws. This took place in September 1944, months before the camp was closed, but because of this, Göth's trial was never heard, as the German war effort was faltering, and his court case was never brought to a courtroom. This ultimately spared him an execution like Karl Otto Koch, the commandant of Buchenwald, who was found guilty of stealing and was then shot inside his own concentration camp. But Amon Göth was described as being mentally ill, and he was locked up in an institution in Bavaria. But he was then arrested by the Americans in May 1945, as to begin with he had avoided the truth that he was a member of the SS, but he was then said to have been recognised by a former prisoner. Because of this, Amon Göth was then brought to trial, and he was sent to Poland to stand trial in the country of his greatest crimes, and his trial took place between the 27th of August and the 5th of September 1946. The courtroom heard of the horrors of his crimes, and evidence came to the forefront about the state of Krakow-Plaszow and how awful Göth was to the other inmates. The courtroom heard of his slaughter of prisoners, and because of this he would be sentenced to death. He was also found guilty of being a Nazi Party member and having ordered torture, imprisonment and extermination. He was also convicted of murder and personally killing, maiming and torturing an unidentified number of people. All of this led to Amon Göth being sentenced to death, and the Polish people considered him one of the most evil war criminals of the Second World War. On the 13th of September 1946, Amon Göth was led out of his prison cell inside of Krakow prison. This was close to the camp where he had overseen. The prison, Montelupich, as it was known, became during the Second World War a place where the Nazis executed many Polish people, but it would be a place where Amon Göth would also lose his life. There was little sympathy for him, and he was taken into the execution courtyard, and there was just a stool with a hook and a rope hanging from the gallows. The executioner confirmed his identity before he was placed on top of the stool. Then the noose was placed around his neck, and the stool was quickly kicked out from underneath him. Because of his evil, a Polish guard allegedly then pulled down on his body, slowly strangling him to death. Amon Göth was one of the most despicable and evil war criminals of the Second World War. He would be a man who was more than happy to be complicit in the slaughter and executions of many people. He would inflict a huge amount of suffering and death onto the innocent prisoners inside of his camp. The prisoners realised if they locked eyes with Amon Göth, then they probably would be killed soon after, and for them he would symbolise the devil. Max Pauly was born on the 1st of June 1907 inside of Wesselburum, and he was the son of a man who owned a hardware store. He came from humble beginnings, but within the Nazi Party he would become a monster like so many would. Pauly graduated from elementary school and then worked inside of his father's store, and he would work as a salesman. But his father died in 1928 when he was 21, and Max Pauly then took control of the hardware store. He would then 2 years later marry his wife, who was also from his hometown, and she was the daughter of a cattle dealer, and the pair would have 5 children together. His wife incidentally would die in August 1944 as the Second World War raged on. But at the end of 1928, Max Pauly then joined the Nazi Party, and he then became a member of the SA, Hitler's brown shirts and violent thugs, who would disrupt political meetings of their enemies, and he would be part of this. The SA would become very powerful, and they would fly too close to the sun, as Hitler would later purge them. But Pauly was considered a member of the Old Guard, or an outer Kampfer, as he was a very early supporter. But he then, in May 1930, transitioned to become a member of Himmler's SS, the paramilitary group of the Nazi Party, who would later be involved in mass execution and slaughter, and also in running the concentration camps. Inside of the SS, Max Pauly continued to rise throughout the ranks, and before Hitler's seizure of power, he was appointed as an SS Sturm leader in January 1932. He then became the head of a local group, but at the time there were a number of attacks carried out by the SS and Pauly's groups. In 1932, the Nazis were not yet in power, but Pauly was arrested many times and accused of breaching the peace, and he would then go on to serve a 7-month prison sentence. He had been allegedly involved in the destruction of a campaign car used by another political party, but following his release from prison, he was then made an SS Hauptsturmführer and then an SS Sturmbannführer. By the turn of 1936, Pauly had also become a full-time leader and a paid-up member of the SS, and he had become a graduate from the Nazi Police Academy, and he would then attend a course which brought him into a concentration camp. Dachau was the first and earliest concentration camp opened, and Pauly would learn here what it took to become a concentration camp guard. He continued to lead detachments of SS men, and he would then take command of the 71st SS Standard in Danzig-Paust, and the command of this group he held until the end of the Second World War. But further promotion came, and following attending and completing another course at the SS Leadership School in Dachau, Max Pauly was then appointed to a new SS battalion, where he worked as a chief of staff. This group was a special unit which operated inside the free city of Gdansk, and Pauly would then take control of the internment camps in the Polish corridor. But as the Second World War broke out, he would be involved and also deemed responsible for the murder of 1,400 mentally ill people. But then in the Gdansk region, he would be given command of the Stutthof concentration camp. He transitioned to the SS Deathheads unit, but he would then oversee Stutthof's creation and opening, but it would become a very brutal camp. Stutthof concentration camp was created following the invasion of Poland, and it was a place where many Polish people would be housed inside of following the beginning of the invasion. It became a concentration camp in 1942, and the original site was surrounded by barbed wire, and it had 8 barracks filled with inmates. But then the camp was enlarged heavily, and a new site containing 30 new barrack buildings, and also a crematoria and a gas chamber was added in 1943. This was to make sure that the executions of prisoners could take place as efficiently and as quickly as possible. 150 people at a time could be held inside of the gas chamber there. The camp staff was made up of many men, but also a number of women who worked there. Women such as Erna Beilhardt, Hertha Bofa and Jenny Wanda Bachmann would become notorious for their treatment of inmates at Stutthof, but as time went on, there were huge transports of women and men who were sent from camps such as Auschwitz. The conditions of Stutthof were very harsh, and dozens of thousands of people succumbed to starvation and disease epidemics that were sweeping through the site. Executions were also carried out at Stutthof, and many dozens of prisoners were shot at the site, with thousands being slaughtered also inside the aforementioned gas chamber. But Stutthof's inmates also suffered at the hands of medical staff, who would inject sick patients with phenol, killing them, and the guards would also violently beat prisoners to death. The forced labour that the inmates were forced to conduct was also horrific, and the prisoners were given insufficient rations for the roles they were doing. But after working at Stutthof for a number of years, Max Pauly would then be transferred to the Neuengamme concentration camp. Neuengamme was a site where there was also a lot of bloodshed too, as almost 43,000 of the 106,000 people held there were killed. The site was based around the idea of extermination through labour, as prisoners were not given sufficient food and they were forced to work in horrific conditions. The medical treatment at the camp was also poor, and many of the people who worked there were forced to create armaments for the German industry. Max Pauly whilst here would control the camp until the end of the Second World War, and during his time he was involved in the slaughter of many children, including those who were sent for medical experiments. He was also involved in the executions of 58 men and 13 women from other concentration camps. He would continue to be promoted, but as the end of the Second World War came around, Max Pauly would be captured. Despite living on site at Neuengamme with his family, Pauly would try to flee the camp and any form of justice. At the end of April 1945, Max Pauly headed to Flensburg, which was considered the last bastion of Nazi power following Hitler's death. But he would return to his hometown, but he was caught living with his children at his sister-in-law's. But then it came to bring Max Pauly to trial for his crimes, and he was a man who was associated with the cruelty inside of Neuengamme, but little was said about his time at Stutthof. He was taken to Hamburg, where he was tried in front of a British military court, and whilst at trial, it was stated that Pauly was a man who was a brute, and was one of the worst commandants who had overseen much bloodshed and execution. Max Pauly was found guilty of war crimes, and he was then sentenced to death for this. He was an experienced man who had worked at different concentration camps. He would never, interestingly, be tried for his crimes at Stutthof, but only for what he did at Neuengamme. He was sent to Hamelin prison to await his death sentence, which would come 5 days later. On the 8th of October 1946, Pauly was led out of his cell into the execution chamber of the prison, and he had met the executioner Pierpoint days before, who had calculated his height and weight, ready for the drop through the trapdoor. Max Pauly was led into the execution chamber and up the scaffold, and Pierpoint had previously secured his arms and legs. A black hood and then a noose was placed over his head, as Pauly was then shuffled over the trapdoor, and this was released. Max Pauly, the commandant of Stutthof, was instantly executed, and he was then buried inside of Hamelin prison's walls, but then he would be exhumed years later, and his body would be moved to a nearby cemetery. He was a man who was notorious for his brutal actions, as a commandant of not just one, but 2 concentration camps, and he became known as a notorious Nazi. But as mentioned, he would not be tried for his actions as a commandant of Stutthof, but what he did as a commandant of Neuengamme would be enough to send him to the gallows and the hangman's noose.
Roland Puhr was born on the 21st of January 1914 in Bohemia, and little is known about his early life, but as a young man he would join the Czechoslovakian military. He would also in 1936 join the Sudeten German Party. He would then, as the Nazi and German influence inside of Czechoslovakia increased, desert from the Czech army and military, and he would then join the German army. But in 1939 he became a paid-up member of the Nazi Party, and he then joined the SS, and he would become part of the SS Death Heads unit, and he would then serve as a guard inside of Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Sachsenhausen was a huge concentration camp, which would see 200,000 people being imprisoned within the barbed wire fences. It was a site where many different prisoners were held, including important prisoners such as Stalin's son and other politicians. Inside of the camp, 50,000 prisoners were killed by the brutal and barbaric conditions, and it was a place where many prisoners were executed in the open. The inmates were poorly fed, and they were not given the correct level of treatment, which led to more death. There was a punishment centre at the camp, where prisoners were held in solitary confinement, and they were then tortured by the SS guards. But executions were carried out at the camp each day, with shootings and hangings taking place in front of other prisoners. The punishment at the camp was very rough, and some would be ordered to perform a Sachsenhausen salute for long periods of time, where a prisoner would squat with their arms outstretched in front of them for hours. They would then be forced to march huge distances each day. Many prisoners would also be tortured and suspended from posts with their wrists tied behind their backs in a medieval form of torture. When he arrived at Sachsenhausen, Roland Puhr
slaughtered and executed many people with his own hands. There were scores of Soviet prisoners of war who were executed at the camp, and Puhr himself participated in these shootings. It's believed that he murdered with his own hands between 30 to 40 prisoners at the site. One of those who he executed was an Austrian prosecutor and lawyer who would be involved in the prosecution of the Nazi who murdered an Austrian chancellor. It's also believed that Roland Puhr was a member of the SS execution squad who carried out a series of killings of a construction brigade near to the city of Düsseldorf. After working at Sachsenhausen for some years, Roland Puhr would then be rewarded in a sense by the SS and Himmler, and he would be promoted to become a commandant of his own concentration camp. But this camp would be considered the only one established on British soil on the Channel Islands. The camp was on Alderney, and it was a labour camp, where many forced labourers and slave labourers were ordered to make military fortifications and installations throughout the Channel Islands. Sylt, as it was known, would be a place where dozens of prisoners were forced to work, and there were a number of deaths at the site, as well as a terrible treatment at the hands of the guards. These prisoners were forced to make bunkers, gun emplacements, and much else, including tunnels. The commandant's house, where Puhr lived, was to begin with inside of the camp, but then it was moved to a different part of the island. The most popular form of killing in Sylt by the SS was strangulation and hanging, as rebellious prisoners were executed. Prisoners who were too sick to work were left to lie in the camp for days without being given anything to eat, and one SS officer then shot a number of men who were doing this. One witness said that, while doing jobs in Alderney, we were near Sylt one day, when we saw a Russian strung up from the gate. On his chest he had a sign which was written, "For stealing bread." His body was left hanging like this for 4 days. But after working here for some time, Puhr then returned back to Germany, as the Second World War had turned against the Germans. But following the end of the war, he would then try to hide out like many members of the SS also would. Concentration camp guards either remained at their camp during liberation when they were arrested, or they then tried to hide out and evade justice. Roland Puhr went into hiding, and he managed to obtain some false papers, and he then began a new life in the north of Germany, and he would manage to escape any form of justice for some time. Decades passed, however in June 1963, Roland Puhr was arrested after his identity was exposed by the East German authorities. Roland Puhr was then arrested and he was interrogated, and he was then charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity. Evidence was heard about his execution and slaughter inside of Sachsenhausen that he did carry out, and also inside the other concentration camps, and witnesses came forward about what had happened. This was in 1963 and was almost 2 decades after the war had come to an end. But despite many war criminals being freed after they were imprisoned, and a general feeling in Germany regarding trials that executions for SS members were a thing of the past, Roland Puhr was sentenced to death. This may have been because he was within East Germany, who wanted to deal with a man who had executed many Soviet soldiers. But Roland Puhr was then sent to Leipzig prison, where he was to await his execution. Appeals were lodged, but these were then turned down, and he was then on the 15th of April 1964 brought from his prison cell into the execution chamber of Leipzig prison. He was to be executed on the guillotine, which was considered a swift execution method. The prison was an East German execution chamber, where many Nazi war criminals and former Stasi officials were executed. Many were given false death certificates. Puhr would be amongst one of those 19 Nazi war criminals executed between 1960 and 1978. He was then led towards a guillotine, where an executioner and his assistant secured his arms and then secured Puhr to a wooden board. Following this, he was then slid under the guillotine and the blade was released, and the former SS guard's head was taken clean off. Roland Puhr was a man who began his military career in Czechoslovakia, but he would then become a member of the Nazi Party. He then participated in many executions and shootings inside of Sachsenhausen, and he would become a ruthless executioner. But he would also be the commandant of his own concentration camp on Alderney on the Channel Islands. But he would, decades later, after the war had come to an end, lose his head on the guillotine at the age of 50.
Johann Schwarzhuber,
was born on the 29th of August 1904 inside of a Bavarian town. He would have a rather normal upbringing and then would train as a printer before he got married at the age of 32. He had 2 children, but at the time there was a growing Nazi movement which was emerging, and Hitler would then become Chancellor, and with this, Schwarzhuber joined the Nazi Party and the SS in 1933. He would not necessarily have a role in the Second World War as it broke out, but he was a man who would find work inside of the concentration camp system. He first went to Dachau, the earliest Nazi concentration camp, and he would work here as a block leader, and it was at Dachau where he first received his training alongside other SS men. Following a short stint there, Schwarzhuber was then transferred at the outbreak of the Second World War to Sachsenhausen. This was a huge site, where over 200,000 people were imprisoned throughout its time in operation, and it's believed that at least 50,000 people died at Sachsenhausen. There were a large number of subcamps that served the main camp, and Johann Schwarzhuber then worked as a commander of the Klinkerwerk subcamp, and he would preside over a number of prisoners each day. He was known for being a brutal man, but he would then, as September 1941 came around, be transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the main extermination element of the largest and deadliest concentration camp. Schwarzhuber was responsible there as a Lagerführer for many different blocks of prisoners, and he would on a daily basis beat and hit some of the inmates. He was known for being a man who was often drunk at Auschwitz, and would also work alongside some of the capos to carry out the deadly operations of Auschwitz. But he was a guard who would get involved in the selections of prisoners who were sent to the gas chambers. He was in November 1943 promoted to become a Schutzhaft-Lagerführer, and because of this he was in control and charge of the whole of the men's camp, meaning it was he who would decide who was sent to the work camp and who was sent to their deaths. Inmates would get off the trains at Auschwitz, in the yards. They would then be separated into those who would go into the camp and work and those who would not. Schwarzhuber's decisions would send thousands to their deaths when they were loaded onto a number of trucks, which then drove the inmates straight to the gas chambers for their deaths. He was a man who would be responsible for hundreds of thousands of executions and exterminations, but he was a man who also was known for having been bribed or swayed in his decision-making. There were a number of examples of Johann Schwarzhuber taking prisoners out of the line from the gassing queue to have them placed in the regular men's prison camp, giving them, in a sense, a form of protection. It's not known why he did this on several occasions, but he was known for having a number of female mistresses at Auschwitz. One of these, it's believed, was Silke Klein, a woman who was 16 when she arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau, but Schwarzhuber picked her to become his mistress, and her story would later become the inspiration for the book The Tattooist of Auschwitz. But he continued to work at Auschwitz, and it's clear that Heinrich Himmler thought a lot of Schwarzhuber, and he was then, in November 1944, sent to Dachau, where he was a commandant of a number of subcamps, but in January 1945, after being at the top of his own camps for some time, he was transferred to a final job at Ravensbrück concentration camp. This was an all-female concentration camp, which became known for its brutality and horror. Around 130,000 women would be imprisoned at the camp, and it's believed that between 30,000 to 90,000 women prisoners were killed inside of the barbed wire fences. The conditions at the camp got significantly worse as the war went on, and all of the women were forced to conduct back-breaking hard labour, and the women were not fed much at all. There was a huge shortage of food, and also disease spread quickly around Ravensbrück, but one inmate described the camp saying, "They didn't shoot the women, we were to die of misery, hunger and exhaustion." When we arrived at Ravensbrück, it was the worst. The first thing I saw was a cart with all the dead piled on it, their arms and legs hanging out, and mouths and eyes wide open. They reduced us to nothing. We didn't even feel like we had the value of cattle. You worked, and you died. The women suffered a lot at Ravensbrück, and they were subjected to assault, and also sick medical experiments at the hands of the evil SS guards and the doctors. But whilst here, Johann Schwarzhuber became the guard who was in charge for the women's camp. This meant that as almost all of the inmates were women, that Schwarzhuber was in command of the entire camp complex, and he was only answerable to the actual commandant Fritz Sören, but he was more acting as a commandant on a daily basis. He was the second most senior figure, and the one the prisoners would see mostly every day. But when he got to Ravensbrück, it was a camp in a poor state, and it was very overcrowded, and food rations were very limited to begin with. In the winter of 1944, many of the prisoners had frozen to death due to poor clothing and heating in the barracks, and because of this, Schwarzhuber took brutal steps to try and prevent further overcrowding. Each day he would carry out the executions of around 50 women, which began as soon as he arrived there. Many of the former guards refused to oversee these executions, but Schwarzhuber took over in this. Ravensbrück would see a huge influx in deaths during his short time there, and thousands of women were also being gassed and killed inside of a new gas chamber that was made when Schwarzhuber arrived. He continued to be a brutal executioner inside of the all-female camp, but in April 1945 Ravensbrück was captured by the British Army, and he was then arrested and was held by the British. Following the end of the war, there were a number of war crimes trials that occurred that sought to punish those SS guards who worked inside of the concentration camps. One that took place was the Hamburg-Ravensbrück trials, and defendant number 1 in the first set of trials was Johann Schwarzhuber. At the time, the main commandant Fritz Sören had fled, and Schwarzhuber was the most senior official who was indicted at the trial. He would plead not guilty to crimes against humanity, and said that the only killing he saw was one mass execution that occurred at Ravensbrück. He said he had looked on as 150 women were sent to the gas chamber and killed inside of it. But it was clear that he was sent to Ravensbrück to carry out mass execution, and he claimed that his bosses had told him to carry out any executions and that he was just following orders. But Schwarzhuber was in charge of the women's camp, and for this he was seen as a man who was responsible for the deaths of thousands, and he was found guilty and was sentenced to death. He was sent to Hamlin prison to await his execution, and it would be notorious executioner Albert Pierpoint who would take his life. He was on the 3rd of May 1947 brought out of his prison cell, as the day before Pierpoint had met with Schwarzhuber and had taken his height and weight to calculate the drop needed to snap his neck instantly. He was then brought into the execution chamber, where a simultaneous gallows was found, and he was led up the stairs of the gallows, and then a cap was placed over his head. Pierpoint checked his arms and legs and that they were secured, before the noose was placed over his head and he was shuffled over a chalk X on the trapdoor. Pierpoint then released the trap, and Schwarzhuber plunged to his death. Johann Schwarzhuber was a man who was responsible for the deaths of thousands of people, and inside of Ravensbrück he was an executioner and an assassin. He was responsible for the torture and evil treatment of different camps where he worked, but at the age of 42, the long-standing member of the SS and Nazi Party supporter would be executed by a British executioner inside of a German prison.
Heinrich Vicor was born on the 30th of June 1921 inside of Baden-Württemberg, meaning that as the Second World War broke out, he was just a young man in his teenage years. But on the 9th of September 1933, Vicor became a member of the Hitler Youth. Inside of this, millions of boys were trained how to one day be a member of the armed forces, and they were schooled in how to become soldiers. They would learn how to fire weapons and would be trained in military drill, and the purpose of this was that in a few years, when the war broke out, Hitler would have a devoted young force who would lay their lives down for his Nazi regime. But before his 16th birthday, Heinrich Vicor joined the SS Totenkopfverbände, or the Death's Head Unit, and these men would be the staff of the concentration camps during the Second World War. Vicor was an incredibly young man to join this brutal group, and it shows how he must have been devoted to the Nazis and Hitler. But in November 1938, he was stationed inside of Dachau, the first concentration camp that would be opened, and many young men were sent here to train in how to become guards inside of the camps. But as the Second World War broke out, Vicor, like many men, were part of the Waffen-SS, the armed force battalions of the Eastern Front, and because of this, other roles were found for him. He completed SS leadership courses and was promoted to the rank of Oberscharführer, and he was moved to work in the local headquarters of the SS main economic and administrative office. Further promotions came, but then in 1944, in June, he was transferred to go and work back inside of a concentration camp. This time Heinrich Vicor was working at Natzweiler Stutthof inside of French territory, and he would be made the commandant of one of the subcamps there. But whilst here he gained a reputation for being evil, and his treatment of prisoners was shocking, and he was known for his brutality, and he was very feared despite being only around 23 years old. He was obsessed with power, and he was then made the commandant in December 1944 of the Natzweiler Mannheim Sandhofen subcamp. It is most probable that Heinrich Vicor was benefiting from the fact many SS men were being transferred to the front line of the conflict as the Second World War was turning against the Germans, and as a young man who had been injured, he was gaining more power as other SS guards moved out to fight for Hitler's remaining empire. When he was at this subcamp though, he did carry out executions, including the execution of a Polish woman who had been involved in sabotaging work. But at the end of the Second World War, Vicor did lead a number of death marches, forced movements of hundreds or thousands of concentration camp prisoners to sites away from the advancing Soviet and Allied armies, as Heinrich Himmler stated that no prisoner should fall into the hands of the enemy. On these death marches, Vicor and his men would slaughter hundreds of people, including during the Hessenthal Death March, where 170 prisoners were killed or they died from the conditions of their march. But there would be one final job for Heinrich Vicor, as on the 28th of April 1945, he was made the final commandant of the first concentration camp, Dachau, but within 24 hours he would be dead. He is remembered as the last commandant, and it was he who on the 29th of April 1945 surrendered Dachau to General Henning Linden of the 42nd Infantry Division of the 7th US Army. Heinrich Vicor had been entrusted with the camp, whilst the former commandant Weiss abandoned it, and under his command were 560 men, many of whom were Hungarian. When the camp was liberated, the American soldiers discovered 39 railway boxcars containing 2,000 corpses parked on the railway outside the camp. Remains were found scattered everywhere, and there was a horrific stench of decaying corpses and human excrement, as well as a sight of emaciated prisoners who were walking around with very little clothes on. Many of the liberators were sick and distraught by what they saw, and the advancing American soldiers told the SS members to surrender and to give up, but some continued to fire at the Americans. As the liberators moved closer, more bodies were found, and many rooms were found with hundreds of bodies inside. However, there would be a series of executions and reprisals carried out against the former guards, and Heinrich Vicor was caught up in these. A group of around 50 prisoners had been captured and were bundled into an area which had been used as a coal store, and this area was enclosed by a high wall. The Germans were looked over by a machine gun team, and Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks left these men to watch over their captives, but as he left them, a soldier shouted, "They're trying to get away," and their machine gun fire was heard. A 19-year-old soldier who manned the machine gun had mown down around 12 of the Germans and wounded many more. It was said of this event that it was a foregoing incident which has given rise to wild claims in various publications that most or all of the German prisoners captured at Dachau were executed. Nothing could be further from the truth. The total number of German guards killed at Dachau during that day most certainly did not exceed 50, with 30 being more probably an accurate figure. The regimental records for this date state that over 1,000 German prisoners were brought to the regimental collecting point. Since my task force was leading the regimental attack, almost all prisoners were taken by the task force, including several hundred from Dachau. There were other accounts that alluded to the executions of German guards inside of Dachau, and it was said some of the Nazis were rounded up and executed along with the guard dogs, near to where the men were shot, and there were more killings as around 25 to 50 guards were also slaughtered by the inmates. It was said some prisoners swarmed over the wire and grabbed the Americans and lifted them to their shoulders. Other prisoners caught the SS men. The first SS man elbowed one or two of the prisoners out his way, but the courage of the prisoners mounted. They knocked him to the ground, and nobody could see whether they stomped him or what, but he was killed. At times, American guards also turned a blind eye to the killing. But it's clear that Heinrich Vicor was executed at some point following surrendering the camp, as a final photograph was taken of him standing in front of one of the death trains, where there were many bodies inside. He had been ordered to be taken to a place where hundreds of corpses were stuffed into, but recent research has emerged in which a photograph showing a deceased SS German officer at Dachau, which appears to be Heinrich Vicor, shows his horrific ordeal. The officer in question is lying on his back on the floor, and he has been shot, but he also has a very battered and bloody face, leading to the idea that he was either set upon by the prisoners or by the American guards. It's more likely that he was shot by the Americans, who were carrying weapons, but he was one of those who was executed following the liberation of Dachau. There is some debate over this photograph, but he was killed following the liberation, as his wife would receive his war pension. Heinrich Vicor was only 23 years old when he was executed inside of the concentration camp he was given command of for around 24 hours. It was his job to surrender the camp to the Allies, as the former commandant ran off and vacated, but at his disposal were over 500 guards. He was executed by American soldiers or prisoners who were incredibly eager to inflict revenge and reprisal for their suffering. He was a very young man who had been involved in many crimes against humanity, as he led death marches at the end of the Second World War. But he was a virulent Nazi who would be responsible for the deaths of many people. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.